All right, in this last lecture, we're going to cover sections 5 and 6, and we're going to start here with changes in gender role and family life. In the first half of the 19th century, families in the northern United States increasingly participated in the cash economy that was created by the market revolution. And the first stirrings of industrialization really shifted away from the home. These changes transformed American notions of what constituted work and therefore shifted what it meant to be an American woman and an American man. Americans encountered more goods in stores and produced fewer at home, and the ability to remove women and children from work determined a family's class status. This ideal, of course, ignored the reality of women's work at home and was possible for only the wealthy. The market revolution, therefore, not only transformed the economy, it changed the nature of the American family. And for quiz purposes, you need to understand that the market revolution thrust new workers into the system of production and redefined gender roles. It integrated families into a new cash economy, and as Americans purchased more goods in stores and produced fewer at home, the purity of the domestic sphere increasingly signified a family's class status. So women and children worked to supplement the low wages of many male workers. Around the age of 11 or 12, boys could take jobs as office runners or waiters, earning perhaps $1 a week to support their parents' income. The ideal of an innocent and protected childhood was a privilege for middle and upper class families who might look down upon poor families. Joseph Tuckerman, a Unitarian minister who served the poor in Boston, lamented the lack of, discipleship and regularity among poor children. And he said it was sad that they're prevented from attending school. Poor children served that they served as economic assets for their families. Meanwhile, the education received by middle-class children provided a foundation for future economic privilege. And as artisans lost control over their trades, young men had a greater incentive to invest time in education to find skilled positions later in life. And formal schooling was especially important for young men who desired apprenticeships in retail or commercial work. Enterprising instructors began to establish schools to assist young gentlemen in preparing for mercantile and other pursuits who wished for an education superior to that of usually obtained in the common schools, but different from a college education and better adapted to their particular business. Warren Colburn of Boston organized the English high school as opposed to the Latin high school to give a child an education that shall fit him for active life and shall serve as a foundation for eminence in his profession, whether mercantile or mechanical, beyond that which our public schools can now furnish. Education equipped young women with the tools to live sophisticated, genteel lives. At 16 years old, Elizabeth Davis left home in 1816 to attend school. Her father explained that experience would lay a foundation for your future character and respectability. After touring the United States in 1830s, Alex de Tocqueville praised the independence granted to their young American women who had the great sense of the world open to her and whose education prepared her to exercise both reason and moral sense. Middling young women also used their education to take position as school teachers in the expanding common school system. Bristol Academy in Taunton, Maine, for instance, advertised instruction in the art of teaching for female pupils. In 1825, Nancy Dennison left Concord Academy with references indicating she was qualified to teach with success and profit, and very cheerfully recommended for that very responsible employment. Middle-class youth found opportunities for respectable employment through formal education, but poor youth remained in marginalized positions. Their families' desperate financial state kept them from enjoying the fruits of education. And when pauper children did receive teaching through institutions such as the House of Refuge in New York, they were often simultaneously indentured to successful families to serve as field hands or domestic laborers. The Society for the Reformation of Juvenile Delinquents in New York City sent its wards to places like Sylvester Lusk's farm in Enfield, Connecticut. Lusk took these boys to learn the trade and mystery of farming and the girls to learn the trade and mystery of housewifery in exchange for sufficient meat, drink, apparel, lodging, washing, and fitting for an apprenticeship and a rudimentary education. The apprentices promised obedience, morality, and loyalty. And poor children also found work in factories such as Samuel Slater's textile mills in southern New England. Slater published a newspaper advertisement for 4 or 5 active lads about 15 years of age to serve as apprentices in the cotton factory. And so during the early 1800s, opportunities for education and employment often depended on a family's given class. In colonial America, nearly all children worked within their parents' chosen profession, whether it be agricultural or artisanal. During the market revolution, however, more children were able to postpone employment. Americans aspired to provide a romantic childhood in which boys and girls were sheltered within the home and nurtured through primary schooling. This ideal was available to families that could survive without child labor, and as these children matured, their early experiences often determined whether they entered respectable, well-paying positions or became dependent workers with little prospect for social mobility. Just as children were expected to be sheltered from the adult world of work, American culture expected men and women to assume distinct gender roles as they prepared for marriage and family life. An ideology of separate spheres set the public realm, which was the world of economic production and political life, apart as male dominion, and the world of consumer and domestic life as a female one. Even non-working women labored by shopping for the household, producing food and clothing, cleaning, educating kids, performing similar activities, but these were considered domestic because they didn't bring money into the household, although they were essential to the household economic viability. While reality kind of muddled the idea between private female world of home and the public male world of business, this really defined the American gender hierarchy. The idea of separate spheres also displayed a distinct class bias. Middle and upper class reinforced their status by shielding their women from the harsh realities of wage labor, and women were to be mothers and educators, not partners in production. But lower class women continued to contribute directly to the household economy. The middle and upper class ideal was feasible only in households where women did not need to engage in paid labor. And for quiz purposes, you need to understand that poorer households, women engaged in wage labor as factory workers, piece workers producing items for market consumption, tavern, innkeepers, and domestic servants. While many of the fundamental tasks women performed remained the same, the key difference was whether they performed these tasks for cash in the market economy. Domestic expectations constantly changed within the market revolution, and it transferred many women's traditional domestic tasks. Clothes production, for instance, advanced throughout the market revolution as new mechanized production increased the volume and variety of fabrics available. This relieved many better-off women of traditional labor obligations. As clothes production became commercialized, women's home-based clothes production became less important to household economy. Purchasing clothes and later ready-made clothes began to transform women from producers to consumers. One woman from Maine, Martha Ballard, regularly referenced spinning, weaving, and knitting in the diary she kept from 1785 to 1812. But this production of clothing was really year-round, labor-intensive process, but it was a way for home consumption, not commercial markets. In cities where women could buy cheap imported cloth to turn into clothing, they became skilled consumers. Even the wealthy women shopped at high-value goods, while servants or slaves routinely made low-value purchases. The mistress of the household trusted her discriminating eye alone for expensive and specific purchases. Women might parlay their skills into business as well. They would work as seamstresses or laundresses, but they might also undertake paid work for neighbors or acquaintances to combine clothing production with management of, say, a boarding house. Even slaves with particular skills at producing clothes could be hired out for higher prices, or might even negotiate to work part-time for themselves. Most slaves, however, continued to produce domestic items, including simple clothes, for home consumption. Similar domestic expectations played out in slave states. Enslaved women in labor fields, whites argued African American were less delicate and womanly than white women, and were therefore perfectly suited for agricultural labor. But the Southern ideal maintained that white plantation mistresses were shielded from manual labor because of their very whiteness. Throughout the slave states, however, aside from the minority of plantations that had dozens of slaves, most white women, by necessity, continued to assist with planting and harvesting and processing agricultural products. White Southerners continued to produce large amounts of food and clothing at home. Even though they were market-oriented producers of cash crops, white Southerners still insisted that their adherence to plantation slavery and racial hierarchy made them morally superior to the greedy Northerners and their callous, cutthroat commerce. Southerners and Northerners increasingly saw their ways as incompatible. While the market revolution remade women's economic roles, their legal status remained essentially unchanged. Upon marriage, women were legally dead by the notion of coverture, which said that married couples were a single unit represented by the husband, And without special precautions or interventions, women could not even own their own money or property. They couldn't be sued or sue anybody. Any money earned or spent belonged by law to their husband. Women shopped on their husband's credit, and at any time, the husband could terminate their wives' access to that credit. Although a handful of states made divorce available, divorce had before only been legal in congressional list states such as Massachusetts and Connecticut, where marriage was strictly a civil contract rather than a religious one. And it remained extremely expensive, difficult, and rare. Marriage was typically a permanent, binding legal contract. Ideas of marriage, if not legal realities, began to change also during this period, and it marked a shift from institutional to compassionate marriage. Institutional marriages were primarily labor arrangements that maximized the couple's and their children's chance of survival. Men and women assessed each other's skills as they related to household production, although looks and personality certainly entered into the equation. But in the late 18th century, under the influence of the Enlightenment thought, young people began to see the privilege of character and compatibility with their potential partners as more important. Money was still essential, but marriages prompted the largest distribution of property prior to the settling of estates at death. But this means of redistribution was changing, especially in the North. Land was becoming less important foundationally, and an increasing emphasis on affection and attraction was embraced and facilitated by increasing complexity of the economy that offered new ways to create wealth, which liberalized the criteria which families evaluated in their potential in-laws. To be considered a success in the family, a middle-class American man typically aspired to own a comfortable home, marry a woman with strong morals and religious convictions who could take responsibility for raising virtuous, well-behaved children. The duties of middle-class husbands and wives would clearly be delineated into separate spheres. The husband alone was responsible for creating wealth and engaging in commerce and politics. The wife was responsible for keeping a good home, being careful with household expenses, raising children, and inculcating them in the middle-class virtues that would ensure their future success. But poor families sacrificed the potential economic contributions of wives and children, and because it was impossible otherwise. The last section here talks about the rise of the industrial labor in Antebellum America. More than 5 million immigrants had arrived in the United States between 1820 and 1860. German, Irish, and Jewish immigrants sought new lives and economic opportunities, and by the Civil War, nearly 1 out of every 8 Americans was born outside the United States. In England, an economic slump prompted Parliament to modernize British agriculture by revoking common land rights to Irish farmers. These policies generally targeted Catholics in southern counties of Ireland and motivated many to seek greater opportunities elsewhere. The booming American economy pulled Irish immigrants toward ports along the eastern United States, and between 1820 and 1840, over 250,000 Irish immigrants arrived in the United States. Without the capital and skills that was required to purchase and operate farms, Irish immigrants settled primarily in these northeastern cities and towns and performed unskilled labor. They usually immigrated alone, and when possible, they practiced what became known as chain migration, which allowed men to send portion of their wages home and would either support their families in Ireland or be able to purchase tickets for them to come to the United States. They followed this pattern during the 40s and 50s, and the infamous Irish potato famine sparked a massive exodus out of Ireland. Between 1840 and 1860, 1.7 million Irish fled starvation and oppressive English policies that accompanied it. They entered manual, unskilled labor position in urban America's dirtiest and most dangerous occupations. Irish workers in northern cities were compared to African Americans, and anti-immigrant newspapers portrayed them with ape-like features. Despite this hostility, Irish immigrants retained their social, cultural, and religious beliefs and left an indelible mark on American culture. Now, for quiz purposes, you need to understand, Irish primarily settled in coastal cities, but German immigrants used American ports as temporary waypoints before settling in the rural countryside. Over 1.5 million immigrants from various German states arrived in the United States during the antebellum period. Although some southern Germans fled declining agricultural conditions and repercussions of failed revolutions, many Germans simply sought steadier economic opportunity. German immigrants tended to travel as families and carried with them skills and capital that enabled them to enter middle-class trades. For quiz purposes, you need to understand that Germans immigrated to the Old Northwest to farm in rural areas and practice trades in growing communities, such as St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Milwaukee, which became known as the German Triangle. Again, know that for quiz purposes. Catholic and Jewish Germans transformed regions of the Republic. Although records are sparse, sparse, New York's Jewish population rose approximately from 500 in 1825 to 40,000 in 1860. Similar gains were seen in other American cities. Jewish immigrants hailing from southwestern Germany and parts of occupied Poland moved to the United States through chain migration and as family units. Unlike other Germans, Jewish immigrants rarely settled in rural areas. Once established, Jewish immigrants found work in retail, commerce, and artisanal occupations such as tailoring. They quickly found their footing and established themselves as an intrinsic part of the American market economy. Just as Irish immigrants shaped the urban landscape through the construction of churches and Catholic schools, Jewish immigrants erected synagogues and made their mark in American culture. This influx of immigration triggered a lot of backlash among native-born Anglo-Protestant Americans. The nativist movement, especially fearful of growing Catholic presence, sought to limit European immigration and prevent Catholics from establishing churches and other institutions. Popular in Northeast cities such as Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and others with large Catholic populations, nativism even spawned its own political party in the 1850s. For quiz purposes, you need to note that party was known as the American Party, or more commonly known as the Know Nothing Party, and it found success in local and state elections throughout the North. The party even nominated candidates for president in 1852 and 1856, and the rapid rise of the Know Nothings, reflecting this widespread anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant sentiment, slowed European immigration, and it declined precipitously following 1855 as nativism, the Crimean War, and improving economic conditions in Europe discouraged potential immigrants from traveling to the United States. Only after the Civil War would immigrants' levels match and eventually surpass the levels seen in the 1840s and 1850s. In industrial northern cities, Irish immigrants swelled the ranks of the working class and encountered the politics of industrialized labor. Many workers formed trade unions during the early republic, and these organizations such as Philadelphia's Federal Society of Journeymen Cordwainers or the Carpenters Union of Boston operated within specific industries in major American cities. These unions worked to protect the economic power of the members by creating closed shops or places where the only employees could be union members, and striking to improve their conditions. Political leaders denounced these organizations as unlawful, and they said they were conspiracies to promote this narrow self-interest of workers above the rights of property holders and the interests of the common good. Unions did not become legally acceptable until 1842, when the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled in their favor with Boston bootmakers and argued that the workers were capable of acting in such a manner as to best subserve their own interest. Even after that case, unions really remained in a very precarious legal position. For quiz purposes, you need to know that in the 1840s, labor activists organized to limit working hours and to protect children in factories. The New England Association of Farmers, Mechanics, and Other Working Men, the NEA, mobilized to establish the 10-hour workday across all industries. That's what you need to know for quiz purposes, the 10-hour workday. They argued that the 10-hour day would improve the immediate condition of laborers and allowed time and opportunity for intellectual and moral improvement. After a citywide strike in Boston, the 10-hour movement quickly spread to other major cities such as Philadelphia. The campaign for leisure time was part of a male working class effort to expose the hollowness of the paternalistic claims of employers and their rhetoric of moral superiority. Women, who were a dominant labor force for factories since the early 1800s, launched some of the earliest strike for better conditions. Textile operatives in Lowell, Massachusetts turned out for the 10-hour workday to show their support. Under the leadership of Sarah Bagley, the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association organized petition drives that drew thousands of signatures from the mill girls. Like male activists, Bagley and her associates used the desire for mental improvement as central argument for reform. Despite the widespread support for the 10-hour workday, the movement achieved only partial success. President Martin Van Buren established a 10-hour policy for laborers on the federal public works projects, and New Hampshire passed a statewide law in 1847. Pennsylvania followed later that year, or a year later. Both states allowed workers to voluntarily consent to more than 10 hours days, which meant that they were going to work more than 10 hours days. In 1842, child labor became the dominant issue in American movement. The protection of child laborers gained more middle-class support than the protection of male workers. And a petition from the parents in Fall River, a mill town in Massachusetts, employed a high portion of child workers, asked for legislation that prohibited the employment of children in manufacturing establishment at an age and for a number of hours which must be permanently injurious to their health and inconsistent with education which is essential to their welfare. Massachusetts quickly passed a law prohibiting children from the age of 12 or under working more than 10 hours a day. By the mid-1800s, every state in New England had followed Massachusetts' lead, and between 1840 and 1860, these statutes slowly extended the age of protection of labor and the assurance of schooling. Throughout the region, public officials agreed that young children between the ages of 9 and 12 should be prevented from working in dangerous occupations, and older children between 12 and 15 should balance their labor with education and time for leisure. Male workers sought to improve their income and working conditions to create a household that kept women and children protected in their domestic sphere. But labor gains were limited and movements remained moderate. Despite its challenge to the industrial working conditions, labor activism in antebellum America remained largely wedded to free labor idea. The labor movement later supported the Northern Free Soil movement, which challenged the spread of slavery in the 1840s, simultaneously promoting the superiority of Northern system of commerce over the Southern institute of slavery, while trying much less successfully to reform capitalism.